For those who join us for the first time, I am Daniele Caramani. I will be chairing the session today. And the session today is a seminar series of the EGPP in the form of a research seminar. And today's presenter is Pierre Schlosser, who is a research fellow at the Robert Schuman Center and scientific coordinator at the Florence School of Banking and Finance. And his presentation is on Europe's new fiscal union, which revisits a book he published in 2019 by Palgrave on this same topic. And I'm very grateful for him being with us and discussing his work. And I'm also very pleased that we can continue to have seminars from diverse disciplines, since EGPP combines various disciplines and values these various perspectives. So thank you very much, Pierre, for accepting our invitation and being with us today. Unfortunately, as you know, we continue to have our seminars fully online, even if the situation in Tuscany is improving. Pierre, you will give an initial presentation of about 30 to 40 minutes, and then we go straight to the Q&A. The author will take questions and comments if you raise your hand through the raise hand function, or if you write me a note in the chat. So to those attending, please keep your microphones muted. If possible, keep the video switched on. Thank you very much to everyone for being with us today, and especially to our speaker. Pierre, I think we are ready to share your slides.
Yes.
And then the floor is yours.
Okay, well, thank you. Thanks a lot,
yes,
Sarah, and thanks a lot, Daniele. It's a pleasure to be together with you and exchange. So I want to thank the EGP program for the invitation. I mean, as many of you in the room know, the European Fiscal Union, let me start my watch, has been on the European Union, on the European agenda since more or less the Raymond Barre reports of the 1960s, and then the Pierre Werner report, which is important to Schuman, of 1970. And I think 50 years after, it's fair to say that Europe is still in a strange place regarding its fiscal identity, understood in the budgetary sense of the word. And one can consider that Europe has been resisting a fiscal union ever since. And I think the Euro crisis has been a good instance of this absence of a Hamiltonian moment. So as you anticipated, the presentation of today largely draws on my monograph, Europe's New Fiscal Union, and which retraced and interpreted the various sequences of the Euro crisis management. And its empirical basis was made of about 60 interviews of European and national policymakers. And I'm in this very period delving back into the finding of my book, also to understand how robust they were, how further specified they could be in light of the recent COVID crisis management, which some, to pursue the metaphor, described as a Hamiltonian moment for Europe. And I'm trying, and I already started that process, also to contact people who I interviewed at the time, who have been also involved in the COVID crisis management, because of the obvious comparative merits that these empirical findings could provide. So what I'd like to offer you today is a recap of my book analysis, a confrontation with its key findings under the new light of COVID, essentially under the new light of the recovery plan. And as a sort of cherry on the cake, I'd like to engage with you on a handful of research agenda avenues that one could imagine to pursue when we confront the institutional and instrumental layering that the Euro crisis and the COVID crisis added up to. And I think that this also follows up very nicely to Bruno's presentation of last week. And so I hope that there will be also some interdisciplinary considerations at the intersection of law and finance. So the puzzle I try to unpack is a rather classic one: how to explain the form that the EU's fiscal union is taking, with a particular light shed on the interplay between actors and instruments. So I'll do that in about 250 minutes. It's great to have a bit of time at last. What is it? 35 minutes. I'll stick to that. The book. So moving to a recap of the book. And for that, we'll go a bit back through history. And here I invite you to recall the magnitude of the euro crisis, which not only brought small and large EU member states to the margin of default, but also threatened the very existence of the euro. Sarah, I think we can move to the essential. I think we can just move to the slide with the book cover. Exactly, thanks. So indeed, I mean, during the very most severe moments of the euro crisis, when Spain and Italy entered the radar of financial markets, one would have expected that the crisis, because of its effect, because of its magnitude, would have been seized as an opportunity for EU leaders to create a formal and genuine fiscal union. And in that occasion, also to clarify who is EMU's lender of last resort and how it is fiscally supported. Intriguingly, this did not happen. So calls for genuine and formalized fiscal unions at the time have been resisted. And by the end of the euro crisis, no fiscal union in the traditional sense of a large borrowing and spending capacity and a central fiscal actor had been agreed upon. Instead, what I observed was that there was a distinctive form of fiscal authority which is institutionalized through varying informal, ad hoc, and covert channels. And those newly centralized powers were not captured by the European Commission, probably for the first time in the history of European integration. By contrast, they've been spread horizontally across both existing and new executive EMU bodies, which is a phenomenon that I analyze in further detail in the book. So against that background, the analysis was guided by the following questions, amongst others. Why did the euro crisis management result in that institutionalization of a central yet fragmented fiscal authority whose constitutive elements are spread across all EMU executive actors, but where no single actor can claim to exert supreme control? And more specifically, with what types of new fiscal instruments was the euro crisis managed? Again, I rely on a distinctive understanding of the concept of fiscal authority, departing from the historical and classic meaning of fiscal authority, taken as the legitimate ability of a nation state to directly raise taxes in order to fund public expenditures. In my view, in my concept, the fiscal authority that has emerged with the euro crisis can be better grasped as a de facto and unintended institutionalization of fiscal powers through various channels. So the idiosyncrasy is all the more valid in the fiscal field, because where the EU now disposes of a stronger fiscal control over a national budget and has even acquired some borrowing powers, it has no classic state-like fiscal powers to directly raise taxes. And I explained that the fiscal authority which emerged with the euro crisis has 4 dimensions, and I'll have a look at the table. So Sarah, if you could just bring up, yes, I think it's next slide, exactly. Where I delineate 4 dimensions. No, there's been with the euro crisis an enhanced fiscal surveillance, which we've seen with the reform of the 6-pack and the 2-pack, a fiscal capacity with financial assistance instruments which have been invented, a lending of last resort capacity, also there largely informal because the treaty has not been changed, and the banking resolution regime, which has a fiscal dimension, even if it's private money. And what I found really interesting and quite telling in uncovering those 4 dimensions was that the time sequence in which those dimensions were constituted helps also to understand a given past dependence of the Maastricht fiscal philosophy, or one might say also paradigm, which was, as you know, centered on the importance of rules. There was, of course, in the Maastricht Treaty, this very centrality of rules, but as we'll see also later on, financial assistance was very limited across EU member states, also because of that no bailout mantra. In a way, we could also argue because there was an instrument which was for EU member states, but non-euro area member states, which was providing, which is called the balance of payments, which was existing, whereas for other euro area member states, when the crisis hit, The toolbox was empty, as Dirk Schoenmaker once wrote. And this, I think, is quite telling of also the importance that fiscal capacities development later on would take. So indeed, during the Euro crisis, leaders were always acting behind the curve, with everything happening at the last moment, as an interviewee told me. And precisely because they were short-sighted and sort of paralyzed by uncertainty, they showed their dependence on previous integration paths, which I argue was a lot of market integration based on rules and regulation. So as the initial pressure following the Greek data falsification mounted, you remember the misreporting of debt data by the Greek authorities. Well, the first response of the EU was, quite ironically, with hindsight, a reinforcement of its rules-based fiscal regime to restore its credibility, to prevent a buildup of future crises. So there was this notion that the very credibility of the rules was at stake, and that needed to be addressed, which again, in the light of the fire that was really raging at the time, clearly rules were not really helping to firefight. Therefore, in a second step, EU governments broke away from this initial logic. They understood the contagion was ravaging, so money had to put on the table, although this was resisted, in the form of financial assistance mechanism. And this proved really to be a critical juncture in the Euro crisis management and marked the moment when EU leaders truly internalized the full extent of the crisis. However, the setup of a large firewall was institutionally and legally very problematic, and I shall go back to this in a few moments. But regardless of that institutional difficulty, the setting up of those financial mechanisms proved insufficient again to calm down markets. So in the third step, EU leaders, and we're here in 2012, committed to address a salient dimension of the crisis that was kept under the carpet. Since the start of the Greek crisis, they recognized that Europe's banking system was fragile and should be addressed head-on through a sounder regime of supervision and resolution in order to kill, amongst others, a doom loop between banks and sovereign. You remember this self-reinforcing dynamic that was essentially weakening sovereigns because of the increased vulnerabilities that they had through their own banks who were buying sovereign bonds. So this decision to institute the new regime, the banking union, was a crucial centralization step. Its aim was to anticipate and prevent future deteriorations in the banking sector's health, and was aiming also at associating the private banking sector to the recapitalization of banks in the recognition that governments did not have endless bailout resources. So in a way, this was an invention that allowed to limit future mutual liabilities across Euro area member states, and that's why it falls within the analysis of a fiscal union, in my view. A banking resolution regime was hence constituted, which was centered around the new agencies, the Single Resolution Board, as well as a common fund, a common Single Resolution Fund, which was financed by a levy on banks, which also there was quite a watershed, I think, in European integration. And here too, however, the promise of a banking union did not lead to a decrease of market pressure, or at least to large extent didn't, on Southern European bonds and on the euro as a currency, which explains the fourth decisive step, which you will all remember, which has been the, in a way, the ECB's exposure towards a role of lender of last resort when Draghi declared whatever it takes in July 2012, coupled with the announcement a few weeks later of the creation of a new liquidity facility, the outright monetary transactions, which constituted the final stage of Euro crisis management in its most, let's say, in its highest period. So again, quite ironically, as market panic unraveled in March 2010, remember the sequence, first prominent and decisive reaction of European leaders was to set up a task force. So the so-called Task Force Van Rompuy came with a recommendation to strengthen the fiscal rules, etc. But then 6 weeks after, sort of tabula rasa, we go into a sort of fiscal institutional building perspective, which is to constitute financial assistance instruments. And clearly, I mean, without the crisis, this catalyst wouldn't have happened. And I think that the persistence of the rules-based logic would have gone on. During all that period, what interviews confirmed is that there was this permanent state of emergency, which ensured that functionalist considerations trumped institutionalist contemplations. Nevertheless, institutional building happened in a covered fashion. There was an incremental creation of complex rules we've seen, but that also led to increased discretion also from the Commission side on the very interpretation of those rules. But there were also new bodies like the FSF and the ESM. And that was, I think, the visible side of the iceberg. The hidden side was the informal empowerment of existing EMU institutions. And I think that here we can say that the ECB going into last resource management, the Commission going more into more discretion, as I said, on the fiscal enforcement, but also on financial assistance, because at the very start of the crisis, the Commission was granted also management tasks of small financial assistance instruments. But I think what was perhaps also less visible was really that the Eurogroup itself had a key role indirectly on financial assistance, because he was essentially overseeing both with the Eurogroup and the Euro Working Group, the ESM, because as you can see, and as Bruno De Witte and Thomas Beukers uncovered, the two governance structures essentially overlap. Another finding was that despite those various empowerments, there was no sort of primus inter pares on the fiscal side that emerged with the crisis. That is something that actually we will revisit based on the current crisis. So I think on the next slide I have 6. So those were the 4 steps that I just went through: the key moments of Euro crisis management, the fiscal rules, the financial assistance, the banking union creation, and I think I put it differently in the book, but essentially the monetary actions of the ECB. And also there, I'll compare later on this sort of sequence with what happened during the COVID crisis. In terms of actors, I think the trilogy is there on the next slides. You can see the 3 actors I mentioned: the Commission, the Central Bank, and the Eurogroup. And also there we'll compare what happened in really rough terms with the crisis of the COVID. So the key findings, it's sort of difficult to summarize 220 pages in a few minutes, but in terms of key findings, I anticipated some of them, and on the next slide, I put them together. So cutting a bit across different chapters of my book, this is what I tried to put together just for the purpose of this seminar as the most important findings that I found. So finding 1, the Maastricht path dependency was broken. This notion that a system based on fiscal rules and on the threat of the no bailout clause didn't resist the pressure of the euro crisis. And I think that with hindsight after COVID, I mean, this looks even more distant now. It's very logic, because as we will see at the very early start of the COVID crisis, the first action was to just deactivate essentially the SGP, the Stability and Growth Pact. Finding 2, an EMU fiscal trilogy was empowered. I covered that. Finding 3, there is no clear fiscal primus inter pares. Finding 4 is a bit more, I think, also forward-looking, and was about the fact that looking at the post-Euro crisis, the fiscal polity was quite unstable. It remained very technocratic and an accountable construct with a high rule density. So what I was recommended, and you can see the normative dimension there too, at the end of the book about this problem was to say that the EU should, one, move away from a crisis management that is too reliant on the European Central Bank. Two, it should constitute a fiscal institution that becomes the legitimate and lead actor in crisis management. And three, it should create new fiscal instruments at EU level and should simplify and revisit fiscal rules. So there was a lot of, as I mentioned, ad hoc institutional instrumental layering. It wasn't clean in any way, like in every crisis. But what I was arguing is that post-crisis, unfortunately, another crisis, a bigger one came in. So this opportunity was sort of lost. But I was arguing there that there should be a moment in which a more rational delegation of fiscal tasks could be performed. And this I say as part of a wider constitutional settlement that I called for in the closing chapter of the book. Now, a sort of side finding, it's not a key finding, but it was interesting to uncover that, was that the French-German tandem played a role, but probably played the wrong role at the time of the euro crisis. You remember the Deauville saga, in which essentially Merkel and Sarkozy were putting fire on markets, on bond markets, by saying that there should be a private sector involvement in the bailout, meaning that there would be a hit on private debt holders, which moved markets. They didn't really understand what they were unleashing there, and antagonized a lot the other member states in the European Council. So there is, of course, a lot of literature on this role of the French-German tandem, but there seemed to be that in that occasion of the euro crisis, it acted more as a sort of directoire than as a benevolent leader for the benefit of all actors. And also this, I will say a few more words when we talk about COVID. So, which I think leads me to the second bit of this presentation. We've covered the book. The book is in the library if you if you're looking for ideas for this summer. And then again, a key dimension of the book is really the financial assistance dimension, which I will zoom in a bit more now on. So on the next slide, I think we're entering that. I have on slide 9. Thank you, Sarah. Exactly. So when the recovery plan was adopted at the time last year, I really had this curiosity about why did something that was heavily discarded in May 2010 as something impossible ultimately ended up being adopted in 2020. So because in the end, the RRP and the EFSM, so an earlier blueprint of the European Financial Stability Facility, are quite similar in the constructs they are. And ultimately, it was deemed by the legal service of the Council, which is quite strong, as Bruno anticipated last week, that one solution was legal, and then ultimately another one was legal. And of course, I don't want to go into the detailed legal analysis, but I think that beyond the law, there is always a political use of the law in EU politics, which I think should well help us or push us to reflect on what are the interests behind, and how do we make sense of those interests. So yes, so what happened at the time in May 2010 was that essentially Greece was in a great difficulty. Therefore, a dedicated facility called the Green Loan Facility was created. And a few days after, it was realized that it wasn't enough. So a dedicated new instrument, a European Financial Stabilization Mechanism of about 60 billion euros was designed. Again, there we're in the period in which European leaders start understanding the fact that they cannot solve this with the existing Maastricht toolbox, and need to set up a new financial assistance mechanism, which poses a series of questions. So a crucial feature of this European financial stabilization mechanism, EFSM, was that the instrument was administered by the Council and the Commission. So concretely, it meant that while the assistance provision was decided by the Council in qualified majority voting, the Commission was in charge of the daily operation of the mechanism and raised bonds on financial markets. So in a way, the Commission, much in the case, like in the case of the GLF, the Green Loan Facility, empowered the Commission to act as a borrower on behalf of the EU. And what's fascinating is that only a few days after, the EFSF is created, which is essentially a special purpose vehicle, so something that is not, of course, of EU law, and in which the Commission has no role at all. So the Commission was sort of struck in between two places in which, at the very start of these negotiations and based on the new EFSM, they were empowered to deliver the borrowing and to make sure that they were in charge of the management of the mechanism. And for the EFSF, a completely different logic. And why did that happen? Well, certainly because the Commission failed to convince finance ministers of that possibility to add to the EU guarantee also EU member states guarantees. Essentially, there was, of course, this notion to make sure that the Commission was kept at arm's length. At the same time, concretely, the proposal was envisaging that loans and credit lines above the ceiling referred to in its second article shall benefit from the joint and pro rata guarantee of the Euro area member states. So the Commission was asking for this role of a fiscal agent, but then interviews I conducted were essentially confirming that the legal constraints impeded the creation of such an instrument. Some interviewee confirmed that the EU Council's legal service just said there is no way that this can pass because the proposed schemes would not work out, and something else had to be elaborated through the intergovernmental way. Essentially, the Council legal service was saying in an ECOFIN meeting that an act of secondary law cannot engage the budgetary sovereignty of a member state. There was a need, apparently, of the own resources decision. And this is something that clearly was different during the recovery phase. Why is that? I would argue that I think the perspective and the relationship to time was really different and to uncertainty, in the sense that the market pressure was extremely high at the time in which financial assistance instrument needed to be created. And there was no visibility as to what effect also that instrument would have on market dynamics. Whereas for the case of COVID, the situation was quite progressive, and bond markets actually remained largely accessible, which means that there was also a time horizon which was quite different. But there are other dimensions which I will cover in more systematic terms. At this stage, what I want to say is that beyond the engineering part, which I'll ask also for support of the lawyers in the room, there was also this very context in which the Commission was not a trustworthy actor for some EU member states. And I think it still remains to me to be solved, the question about whether another solution than the creation of an SPV outside of EU law could have been found within EU law, not necessarily for the EFSF, but also later on when the European Stability Mechanism was created, because that was an occasion also to sort of cleanly constitutionalize and then set in clear terms the role of the EFSF, which was again the BERS in really difficult times. But to me, that occasion was sort of missed with time. The other point I wanted to bring in was the fact that yes, there were three. I think if we now compare to the situation currently, meaning last year, where there was some difference was on the fact that those three fiscal actors behave quite differently. So the ECB, despite its continuous support during the COVID crisis, made it clear that it wouldn't cross a line. It had crossed under Draghi, making sure that essentially governments would be responsible for the fiscal dimension. The Eurogroup, despite being a very central actor also of the COVID crisis, and while remaining a central negotiation hub also during this one, I mean, in terms of financial assistance, they don't sit on the instrument in the same way that they did with the ESM. And the Commission instead is being empowered with, to me, a clear fiscal task and also a clearer space to become a real economic policy coordinator, which is something that I'm happy to discuss. So although trust has probably been fading away, I mean, it's a fair point to say, ever since the very rollout of the vaccines, at the time of the next generation EU adoption, the Commission had much more trustworthiness than the Commission had in May 2020. Yes. Moving on, thanks, Sarah, for just moving to the, yes. So moving to differences, because again, there are similarities in terms of the instrument that was chosen. Happy to go more at length on that. But there are clear differences in the two periods. No, the first one is the nature of the shock. If we can see on the table that is going to appear that we're talking about two different shocks, one which is economic and another which is a security shock in a sense. Sarah, if you could just put the next table, thanks. Economic shock of the euro crisis, fiscal, banking, competitiveness, some have argued. Okay, in the COVID crisis times, it was more of a security shock, which has an impact also on the way in which the perceptions of actors evolved during the crisis. Some of my interviewees were saying at the time of the euro crisis that, in a way, the veil of ignorance actually was taken away, and every member state could really see how it could be impacted through the crisis. Whereas for the COVID, there was this uncertainty on the distributional impact. So perhaps that played a role in the way this new solidarity instrument was accepted. Which speaks also to the first point, which is the difference of asymmetric and symmetric. No, so that's another difference in terms of the nature of the shock, as is the fact that, as some have argued at least, the euro crisis was partly self-inflicted and so partly internal, whether the COVID was more of an external shock. So very different dynamics there, and I think that it's very early still to assess exactly how to weight factors across those. In terms of the political context, here I mentioned that aspect. No, the fact that for the euro crisis, the bond markets were really a disciplinary factor for several euro area member states. Whereas in this context of very low and at times before negative interest rates, this was not a problem for COVID, which can also ask the question as to the recovery, you know, once the interest rates go up again. There was, in the case of COVID, also a new EU leadership. Whereas before the euro crisis, there was a fatigue EU leadership. There was a strong North-South divide in the European Council. Here, of course, I mean, the Council dynamics always very difficult, but there was a bit more of a French-German leadership this time. And I think something that an interviewee mentioned and that I hadn't on my map was also the position of the crisis on the negotiation axis about the multi-annual financial period. So there was a sort of neat coincidence of the fact that the COVID also happened at the time in which the new EU budget was negotiated, was also opened up for synergies with the EU budget that, in a way, during the Euro crisis, there was no room for. On the next slide, I think I go a bit more into, well, let me skip that one and go back to it. Yes. So on the next slide, yes, let's go to just the summary table. And then I'm happy to go back to this in a second. So on the summary table, you can see that the first two lines I've covered already. What the key solutions adopted, in a way, are quite close in nature compared to what was adopted at the Euro crisis, which is, again, instruments, as I mentioned, also monetary instruments. And we could see also that scale up of instruments adopted at the EU level was with SURE, with other types of reusing cohesion funds, which were used before next generation EU. But then again, the order was quite different. The order, the sequence was very different because the first action during COVID was to say we deactivate the pact. And right now only the Eurogroup and the Council will discuss how to revise the new fiscal rules. So was there learning? This is one of the key questions, I think, for scholars in that process. And then most importantly to the analysis is also the institutional effects. No, at the time of the Euro crisis, there was a proliferation of ad hoc functional solutions, a marginalization of the Commission, I mentioned it, and no real delegation of crisis management to the Commission. Whereas in this occasion of the COVID crisis, there was a reliance on the EU treaties flexibility and a reliance and trust of EU actors in particular in the Commission. So what does that mean? And here I go back to the previous slide in terms of the Mickey Mouse graph I have on the three actors. What I argue is that essentially the European Commission has gained, in a way, has been empowered by this crisis. The Eurogroup has stayed central, but mostly, let's say, on the negotiation of the whole package, whereas the central bank was more behaving in extraordinary times, but was not de facto filling a void of, as an interview was formulating, a void of decision makeability. So in the sense that at the time of the Euro crisis, clearly there was a moment in which EU leaders should have put more fiscal commitments on the table and were reluctant to do so, which explains why essentially the ECB had to cross a line and ensure that the self-fulfilling prophecies were not leading to the breakup of the euro. Connected to that very point, I have a few considerations, and I know that time is moving, but I thought that also going back into that those findings, I confronted myself with different really avenues of research. And as you can see, I moved very fast from the institutional aspects, the instrument aspects, and a more systemic consideration linked to the system development of EMU. And so on the closing slide I just wanted to guide you through that. So indeed, one is obviously, which I think should be of interest to scholars, is how can the differences between the Euro crisis and COVID responses be interpreted? And I think that I started there with different dimensions, probably needs to be reassessed in more exclusive terms. But the question I think is a relevant one, is to what extent did different factors, of course, produce a solution that in functional terms was quite similar to one of the solutions offered for the euro crisis. Then I think I had a point on the next bullet point, again, on the impact of the new COVID management instruments on the Commission. Because clearly the fact of having this borrowing power, even though the whole instrument, as we know, is temporary, is giving also some more scope for coordination. And as a result of an interview I had recently with someone who was involved in both COVID and the euro crisis management, was essentially leading to the conclusion that there is no other actor who can coordinate and analyze recovery plans of member states. It's this person gave an example. The recovery plan of Portugal is going to be about 800 pages plus annexes. We're about 10,000 pages. So who's looking at that? There is, I mean, no one in the council can do it. Perhaps the ESM would have been helpful on their staff to provide support, but clearly they were deemed as a politically incorrect solution here, meaning that their staff, I understand, is not going to be mobilized for that. But that again, and we're here in the realm of I think also rule density. To what extent can the Commission use its discretion also in that situation? Up for discussion. Another related aspect, I think, is the third bullet point, and this I find really fascinating, is to what extent can those new fiscal capacities then be linked also to other forms of EU regulation? And we've seen this already coming up with, I think, the European semester. So the European semester, as I was discussing with an interview recently, was very much an exercise for its own purpose at the time when it was created. I mean, there were big hopes when it was created, but then afterwards, it was very much of a reporting and framing exercise. The fact that now there will be a connection between the European semester and the recovery plan leads to new opportunities for the Commission also to arbitrate between I mean, to use the European semester as an economic policy coordination device. The same way for the taxonomy. There will be connections with the EU green taxonomy that the Commission is developing to make sure that essentially a whole new possibility of conditionality within the EU political system this time, because last time it was, of course, as you know, ESM and Eurogroup, it was not, it was quite ad hoc and was not really linked to those general economic policy coordination which are within the EU system. So this, I think, is probably gonna be an interesting area for further research. Then the fourth point I had, Sarah, I think the fourth bullet point was the impact of the recovery fund creation on the EU fiscal framework. As I anticipated, there will be a review further down the line this year. And the question is whether those special factors like investments in green, investment in digitalization, etc., will that be subtracted from deficit figures in, let's say, the revised six-pack, two-pack, SGP, whatever we call it, which also there would lead to this sort of quid pro quo dimension between the rules and the policy objectives. Then I think that I had one or two other areas of further research, and I hope that this is going to be also food for thought for the discussion. A very provocative one: did the recovery plan kill the Maastricht fiscal paradigm? Because at the time of Maastricht, again, the logic was fiscal policies remain decentralized, but under central rules, which were supposed to be credible at the time. Now those rules have been put have been deactivated for the time. We're now looking really at new fiscal capacities, and the question is really, you know, can we have a euro that is still centered on this very notion that economic and fiscal policies in particular are coordinated only by law? And this is, I think, I would think is something that is going to also stick on the agenda, because the workability of it is really problematic. Everyone is agreeing that the rules, in any case, are too complex. There's probably only one person in the commission who knows exactly, not only the 6-pack, the 2-pack, but also all the vademecum and all the appendixes and how to interpret them as of now, which is not helping anything and is not great, as we can agree, in terms of accountability. And then did I have a last one? Perhaps I did. Yes, the use of funds in EU public financial management, which I was quite excited some time ago, because I could see the proliferation of different funds, and the recovery one being quite, I mean, a marked example or illustration of this. However, what I got in terms of feedback from the 2 interviews I've conducted in the last weeks was that essentially this proliferation is probably linked to the fact that there is an unanimity consideration, so that essentially member states are happy to beef up the funding, but they really wish to keep in control, which explains also the governance, I think, at the time of the EFSF. And so perhaps there is less food for thought to be put in this than what I initially thought. I think that time is moving forward, so I would at this stage leave it there. I'm aware that this was a very fast tour d'horizon, and at this stage everything is extremely work in progress. I'd like to use this occasion to hear from you on possible future directions, and how also you yourself consider useful a comparison between these 2 periods, May 2010 in particular, and the creation of the recovery fund. Thank you very much, and happy to engage in the Q&A.
Thank you very much, Pierre, for this tour d'horizon. It was very instructive, and I particularly enjoyed the comparative part between the 2010 measures in response to the financial crisis and a year ago, or right now, in fact, on the COVID crisis. Sarah, I was thinking that maybe it would be good to have the slides still visible also during the Q&A, in case people would like to go back to it, especially the table, maybe the table with the comparison. It was towards the end, the summary table.
Yeah, I think we're in slide 10, or yeah, exactly. 10, no, sorry, there is an even larger one, so that should be slide 14. 13, yes. 13, yeah, 13.
The one before this, yes, exactly.
Thank you.
Yeah. I'm not saying that we have to talk about this table, but I thought that this was summarizing quite nicely what you said. It could be useful to have it visible. It's possible to make it smaller on your own screen if you don't want to have it too prominent on it. Very well. I think we can start with the Q&A. I'm looking in the chat, or the hand. I see Bridget and then Bruno. So maybe we can go in this order. Bridget, please.
So Pierre, thank you for a very engaging presentation, and it brings me back to your original work quite some time ago, and I think I would strongly encourage you in the direction you're taking it. In terms of just two common stroke questions. So firstly, in terms of the nature of the shock, I think one important difference between the Eurozone crisis and the COVID crisis is that the Eurozone crisis was about a major EU regime that could have collapsed, whereas COVID was a global crisis, in fact, in an area that the EU itself did not have competence. So the stakes were somewhat different, and I'm not sure that your analysis reflects that, just your thoughts on that. And then I think there is a central question here, and that is, did the EU learn collectively from crisis one, Eurozone, to the speed of reaction in terms of the pandemic, both the ECB, but also the other actors? And was the mechanism learning? And how would one, my question is, how would one engage in a theory-driven analysis of learning from crisis A to crisis one to crisis two?
Thank you, Bridget. Pierre, if you would like to respond directly.
Yes, of course. No, thank you. Very, very good points. And indeed, I think that the, in a way, the euro crisis, on your first point, the euro crisis really was hitting the euro area in particular on its Achilles heel, which was really this fiscal identity in a way, because and the narrative of the Greek crisis took over very fast, which led to a sort of very confrontational course on bailing out or not bailing out, and on this fundamental aspect. And as I think you indicate, also the fact that the euro was at stake was in a way existential for that purpose, whereas in the COVID crisis, yes, I fully agree with you there too, that there is no, I mean, there was not a fundamental existential threat on the EU political construct, nor on the euro area political construct, other than the sort of feeling as of now that, there is probably an economic and financial crisis still looming. And so we'll see whether the new instruments of economic policy will withstand this ongoing turbulences. On the learning aspect, so your second comment and question, I think that I'm quite new to the literature, so I'd like to read a bit more on this first, but I can see a lot of prospect in doing that, but I would then really stick to a micro, and I think that equals also past discussions, micro actors, because that's the only way, I think in my sense, to make distinctions very clear and identify factors in a clean way. Because if I can identify a series of people who've been really involved in both crises, and can also explain how, from an internal perspective, the learning emerged, and demonstrate and document that, then I think that it could work. But the difficulty is, again, to make sure that you distinguish, you disentangle the internal and the external factors, because at the end, I think we're at the level of single also policy actors. So at what level of actions do you want to go to analyze that? So happy to have also any suggestions from any of you there. But indeed, I think that there is a lot of prospect there on the learning side.
Thank you. I have Bruno next.
Yes, thank you, Daniele. So that was super interesting, Pierre. So congratulations. And I certainly think that this idea of comparing the two crises from a fiscal policy and institutional perspective is really interesting. I'd like to make 3 small points here. One is about something you mentioned during your talk, is that when comparing the reactions in 2010 and 2020, you said the Council Legal Service said that, making the EFSM much larger would be illegal. Whereas in 2020, they said, well, creating this huge borrowing capacity is legal, actually. I don't think there is much of a contradiction, actually. What they said in 2010 is, if we want to have a massive firepower, of the European Union to combat the crisis, we need to change the own resources decision, because we need the backing, the guarantee function of the member states for the EU budget. Changing the own resources decision usually takes like 2 years, because this has to be, approved and ratified by all the national parliaments. So basically what the Council said, if we want to take quick action, and we did need to take quick action at the time, this is a no-go. We can't we need to modify the own resources decision and we can't do it. Whereas, of course, in 2020, as you say, and as it's written on this slide, we were in the middle of a negotiation of the MFF, the Multi-Annual Financial Framework, which always goes hand in hand with a revision of the own resources decision. So that these two things always go together. Also politically, you need unanimity for the MFF and you need unanimity for the own resources decision. So it's quite tough, but it can be done. And so this time they said, well, it's a good time now. We need to change the own resources decision anyway, to adapt it to the new MFF. Let's now create this massive new capacity, financial capacity for the EU. Let us now allow the European Union to borrow massively on the market, something that was not possible in 2010. So it's not so much that the law changed or the legal analysis changed, but the circumstances were more favorable, maybe. A second point is about the very last point you said, where you said, well, actually, when I thought that the European Union funds are being put to a new use in the context of fiscal policy, that you were a bit disappointed by what you found. But in fact, what I think you should draw the net a bit wider. I think what we see here is that the funds are being used increasingly for non-fiscal policy goals. I think that is actually an interesting development, is that through the use of funds, and of course now especially of this huge RRF recovery and resilience facility, what the European Commission is doing is to pursue its non-fiscal policy goals, goals of environmental protection, climate change, digital transition, what have you, by using money, by cajoling or pushing member states in the direction it wants by offering financial incentives. And so that is a new way of regulating by the use of money, of regulating existing policy goals. Third point is a question, is something you haven't mentioned at all, is differentiation, differentiated integration. I would like to know your opinion on what the recent developments mean for differentiated integration. Because before 2020, most of the thinking about fiscal policy assumed that major changes would happen within the context of the Eurozone, as a form of differentiated integration. Whereas, of course, the Recovery Fund is an EU-wide operation involving all the member states. So what does that mean? Is differentiation, differentiated integration out of the window? Is it not going to happen? Or will we get back to that? Once the COVID crisis has been addressed, after a few years, will we get back to thinking about future fiscal capacity in terms of the Eurozone as opposed to the EU, or not? What is your idea about that? Thanks.
Thank you, Bruno. Pierre?
Yes, no, always very insightful and challenging. Thanks a lot, Bruno. And for further specifying on the first point you had on the legality/illegality, indeed, I think I went a bit fast. What I wanted to emphasize the centrality of the own resource decision. What I think was an opportunity that I still wonder why it wasn't used. Of course, time was of essence, as you outlined. No, for the FSF, they needed to do that over essentially a few days. So it was obvious that then a larger constitutional revision and change wouldn't be envisaged, even at the level of their own resources. However, there was an opportunity. So essentially what happened was that the EFS was created, and then it was obvious that this would be then replaced by a permanent mechanism. And I think where the reflection is also very interesting is to ask, at the time when the European Stability Mechanism and the separate treaty was then elaborated, and you remember there were different versions of it, why then wasn't it considered, knowing that it would anyway take time to do that, to put it immediately and straight in the EU order? as something that could be something of the same size because it's comparable, and form of the recovery plan. And I think that this is where perhaps then this institutional interest played a role. That's I think where I'd like to do some further digging, because there was an open window for a more rational and EU-based articulation there. Why was this discarded remains a puzzle to me. But on the FSF, I fully agree with you that indeed it was time, and the legal service in a way was coherent on the conditions it had put at the time and now. The second, please. Okay. Second point you had was about the funds being used for non-fiscal policy goals. Absolutely, this is where I think the new politics is really in the sense of spinning over to economic policy, where indeed I can cast a wider net, and I think that I see, or perhaps I saw, a unifying feature in something that is quite diverse, because if you look at the number of new funds that have emerged in the last 10 years or so, there is a single resolution fund. There is also the defense fund. There is also the Juncker plan, which was this, I forgot now, EISF, I think it's called, was also taking the form of a fund. So I initially wondered, is this really more interesting as an instrument than a program or something else, because it's legally interesting for the actors, or is it because there are all these cultural ideational dimensions about new public financial management? It's a sort of more efficient way to do things. I think that there is a governance issue that is to be further digged, and the other part is as you say, is to what extent can it be connected to other EU policy objectives. And this is again where I see that there can be opportunities for the Commission to put more conditionalities and to link it to. So it's a way, in a way, it could be an internal soft power of the Commission using its own regulations. I think on the taxonomy, it's quite obvious that they're using that as a standard to make sure that also the very standard has more grip, because if then recovery plans need to be aligned in steady state or in the medium term with given standards about what is green and what is not, then you can expect that this is going to also ensure and give more strength to the very standard that the Commission adopted. And this, I think, is something that is also within the Commission new for the policy staff. You can see that DG ECFIN, which was completely in a way isolated, working on the rules and on the interpretation of the rules and on national fiscal policies, now also have to work also with other DGs and are a bit out of their economics bubble. And this is quite interesting also to see as a development, and I think goes in the direction that you're flagging. As for your third point question, yes, I mean, the immediate reaction I had was that it would, I mean, in a way that the recovery plan was an undifferentiated response to the crisis. I mean, it was in a way standard EU action. Now, how standard is it really when there is money involved is a related question. As we know, the Parliament doesn't have a role. So to me, this is closer to, let's say, second or third pillar of Maastricht in terms of not being community method for the role that also the Parliament has, but empowering the Commission. And I think that it's related to the fact that, again, it wasn't an economic and financial crisis. It led beyond the instrument of the euro, and I always thought that, you know, in a way, a security crisis would have led to a stronger fiscal center in the EU anyway, compared to this endless discussion about, you know, we have a EMU fiscal capacity, as was the reflection before. We have an EMU treasury, and in the middle, there are a lot of actors who would have a hard time to find to consolidate their position, and the Commission was always a problem in that reflection, because I don't think that they promoted that when until the package about the European monetary fund and the finance minister, which was a proposal that with this crisis was completely wiped out. So I would consider that the EU dimension of the fiscal authority at the central level has more traction now than the euro area, but of course I can be wrong.
Thank you very much. Carlos Closa is next. Please, Carlos.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Pierre. That was a really beautiful presentation, and I really learned a lot. And I'm sorry I missed Bruno's presentation last week, because probably there was a lot of complement between both of them. I have 2 points for you, Pierre. The first one is to invite you to reflect on the counterfactual in your input conditions. When you mentioned leadership, there was a factor that I missed there, which was namely the presence of the United Kingdom. The United Kingdom was a very disruptive partner in the negotiation of the former crisis. They choose to stay aside from the instruments agreed. And in this crisis, of course, the United Kingdom didn't play a role simply because they were already out. So I know that this is inviting you to reflect on the counterfactual, but don't you think that there should be something to take into account into the political input conditions that you pointed out? And the second one is a petition to elaborate a little bit more on the theoretical implications that you hinted at the very end. When you were presenting the findings, I was really already going in the direction of asking you about path dependency and specifically critical junctures. I'm not very keen on this analogy with the Hamiltonian moment, but certainly there are elements there that invite to think about whether we are in a crucial juncture. So you speak about the activation of the Stability and Growth Pact, but there are also some other elements. One of them very important that Bruno mentioned. Own resource decision was approved by unanimity in a very quick period. In just 6 months, we have a decision. And that makes a strong difference with the previous EFSF, because that did require unanimity, but not unanimity from all member states, and the same happened with the ESM. So there is a kind of change in the situation now. And then also the word of the day today is spent. In the previous crisis, the world were not spending money. Now there is a different attitude. So to what extent this anticipates some kind of critical juncture, a change in the paradigm standing in terms of macroeconomic and fiscal policy in the European Union? It's just simply something that we can consider a momentaneous arrangement of the instruments, but that will perhaps fade away in a few years' time. Thank you.
Thank you.
Yes, thank you, Carlos. Very, very helpful, and I'm certainly going to need a bit more time to think about also the theoretical implications. On the Brexit side, yes, I mean it's a very good point. What I gathered, and it's sort of reflecting also, I think, common sense, is that clearly the negotiation on the recovery plan would have been much harder if the UK was still in. No, this is a very important element that also allowed for a smoother negotiation, and I think that you can relate that point also to the French-German leadership. They had an easier time, also because the large member state at the time present for the 2010 discussions had to be out, and that also links to Bruno's point, I think, about differentiation or not differentiation. At the time, I think the EFSF and the ESM and all the negotiations at the euro area level were probably also driven by the fact that well, the UK didn't want to increase its fiscal liabilities. There was, as you remember, lots of discussions about the rebate, and this, I think, altogether, the fact of increasing the size of the EU budget, the fact that there was, I think, the notion that essentially there was a taboo, and that there was a need to work around constraints all the time. And I think that sort of, in a way, summarizes the conditions of the various instruments that were adopted for the Euro crisis management. Whereas here, I think that again, the connection with the timing on the MFF opened a connection that wasn't made at the time. So I think that is what the reaction that was sparked by your comment on Brexit from my side. On the theoretical side, yes, to what extent was it a critical juncture? I think for the rules, it's a bit early to say, but you can clearly see that the revision is going to be telling us much more about how lasting will be the effect of that crisis on the fiscal policy of the EU. I think there that, I mean, from the preliminary interview I did that with a person who's been around for maybe too long, but was saying, I don't expect a revolution in terms of the new fiscal system, but there will be some dimensions that will tame down let's say, the automaticity of the rule interpretation. And so I expect there a bit more discretion again for the Commission, and the question is going to be on which criteria are they going to assess, the digitalization, the environmental types of expenditures, because, as you know, I mean, it's very much now a discussion about metrics in the interpretation of the fiscal data, and another consideration linked to that is also to what extent could the EU, the national contribution to the EU budget also be taken out of the deficit figures? And I think that this might be something that will also come up when the new rules are discussed. So past dependent or really past diverging, I think it's really early to say. What was quite telling in terms of difference was really this approach towards deactivated immediately the fiscal rules. And I do think that this is probably the most telling learning that the leaders demonstrated compared to the 2010 crisis, also linking back again to the point made by Bridget. And for the on-resources decision connection, I think that this is something I'd like to study more. And so I don't think I'm prepared to answer right now, but happy to keep on the dialogue going forward.
Excellent. Thank you very much. Adrienne Héritier is next.
Thank you very much, Pierre, for this very interesting presentation. And I do think that the comparison is very insightful. Or I think on a path to show interesting differences. And you kind of have this distinction between input factors, which are causes in a way, nature of the crisis, political conditions, and then the institutional window of opportunity, the MFF. Now, these are already very important explanatory factors here, which you have, and you present already interesting empirical insights comparing the two types of crisis. Maybe I just would like to add that when you say crisis, asymmetric effect, self-inflicted or not self-inflicted, what of course you have an extremely strong, also is the open decision-making situation with an extreme time pressure in the case of COVID, but also the financial crisis. And that in a way you do not mention now explicitly here, but when you now said an immediate kind of the Stability Pact not to be applied till 2024 now or 23, yes. It was an immediate reaction to this urgency of acting fast. And as regards the political conditions which you list here, I think are all important. And then the institutional factor, which is a window of opportunity, the MFF, which is something which is just not a contingency, but in the institutional calendar, which helped, right, as you pointed out. Now, on the side of the effects, you have the outputs in terms of policies, and then the institutional effects, which I think are both very interesting. Now, when you say all this is couched in learning theory, I was a bit puzzled, because you already have all these explanatory factors in your what you call inputs now. So what would be an additional kind of causal argument of learning theory, except of patient updating, that actors have more information now, therefore, as compared to the first crisis, therefore they do something a bit different. But it doesn't really give you kind of a causal edge in your argument, right? Of a causal explanation, which you say, oh yeah, that's in a way that's new. To the point which was pointed out by Bruno, which I think is extremely important and interesting to observe, but not the very first one, that is the expansion of European policy influence through the funding, which are not exclusively fiscal, but of whatever nature the policies are, because they are all in a way assessed in the light of fiscal necessities, but the nature of the policies are not necessarily fiscal. Of course, we already had this in the European semester, right? In a way where the Commission is intruding in whatever policy area of member states you could possibly think of, right? Through a fiscal control. So in a way, the really important question then will be, which we discussed also in the last session in the context of Bruno's presentation, is, so how strict will this control be, right? In kind of shaping the policies at the member state level. That will be really interesting to observe. And maybe just a small last point regarding critical junctures, just mentioned by Carlos. I think that is something which you always can see ex post, right? But you never can predict a critical juncture coming up with some causal explanation. You can't do it. You can say, looking back, say, okay, that was a critical juncture and we embarked on path A or B, right? And then we can't leave it anymore. Thanks.
Thank you, Adrienne. Pierre, if you'd like to reply.
Yes, no, thank you. Extremely interesting, and I think that indeed the time pressure, the time pressure can be articulated in a clearer way. What I think is linked to that is of course the fact that there is the time pressure, of course, is something that acts on leaders, and they would reason in terms of the cost that action and inaction would be having, no, based on the time pressures that they have in front of them. And this leads a bit to reflection on the distributional consequences, but not in abstract terms, really in the way that actors at the time in which they had to decide about crisis management measures would anticipate the impact of the various crises, be it the Euro crisis or the COVID crisis. And I think that this needs to be actually put in a wider light of also the benefits that central crisis management would act. So we're talking about for COVID last year, at the time in which uncertainty was still very high as to how would one member state compared to another be impacted, and also to what extent could also member states draw on additional resources to fight very much this crisis. Whereas I think in the Euro crisis instance, this was less the case, because there was the challenge for governments was more to make sure that they were credible on the bond markets, but they didn't think that they would need grants from the EU to make sure that they would weather the Euro crisis, no. And so the issue was more making sure that their spreads would be low enough not to have to access the ESM and its conditionality. And so I think that on the distributional side, there is more analysis to be conducted, not necessarily on, and that's a difficulty, not necessarily in pure factual terms, but on the perception of actors as to the anticipated distributional impact of the crisis, which at some point at the very start was really, this is affecting China and then it's affecting Italy and that's it. Meaning that it was not an EU problem. But then with time, as we could see, it became that, also because they could see that the distributional consequences were quite unpredictable. Whereas in the Euro crisis, again, the veil of ignorance was sort of lost very early throughout in the process. Maybe that's a way to answer that part. And indeed, I mean, you're always very helpful, Adrienne, on the theoretical and conceptual part on the learning. I would have to revisit. Indeed, I mean, it's new information, and to what extent is that the causal link needs to be assessed. Your point, I think, connected also the last point on the EU influence, and I think that links to what Bruno was saying. I think that before the recovery plan, in a way, the Commission on the fiscal side was doing what had a stick but didn't have a carrot, which was always a problem. How to make sure that people respect the buffer of the SGP and make sure that in good times it put aside and in bad times then the automatic stabilizers can play was always a problem, because other than just saying you should respect that, otherwise you're going to have sanctions which are never applied, it was not really a strong carrot in the first place. And so there were discussions also during the Euro crisis about linking the carrot with linking the stick with some carrots, which was called, I think, the CCI, the Convergence and Competitiveness Instruments. The idea there was to do in EU law what essentially a program action would have performed within the ESM and within the conditionalities. And I think that now we're closer to that with the recovery plan, because the EU and the Commission can connect carrots and sticks going forward, which will again leave much more opportunities to go beyond the simple fiscal expenditure and think about economic policy, central economic policy objectives, which I think before was just a collection of national economic policy objectives, just shared first in the broad economic and policy guidelines and then after in the European semester.
Very well, thank you, Pierre. I don't see additional hands. Let me check the chat also. Maybe you allow me to add something to this very interesting discussion. Pierre, I was very intrigued by the comparison, and I was looking at the very first line of the table, and you say the Euro crisis is an economic shock and the COVID crisis is a security shock. But as you said yourself, and as the discussion showed, it is also very much an economic shock, a major, dramatic economic shock, and all the measures are also financial measures, as you show in the output. So that leads then to say that the Euro crisis was there was a north-south divide. There was something territorial about it. I mean, you framed it also very interestingly in terms of veil of ignorance. But in the Euro crisis, there was something territorial about it. Countries were pitched against one another. Whereas in this crisis, also financially, you put French-German leadership. And there I would have a bit of different approach. And I wouldn't stress so much the French-German leadership, because I don't think that's really what it is. It's that in this crisis, you don't seem to find, or we don't seem to have a territorial opposition between countries. The opposition is much more one that cuts across member states. It affects in the same way those professional categories who cannot work from home, against those who can. So certain categories that you find in all countries are suffering more than other segments of the economy. And that's something that I think makes it quite different between the two crises, is that you don't have this territoriality in this one. It's more a class thing, whereas in the previous one, you had a European-wide territoriality. So certain countries against the interest of certain countries against those of others. I mean, I was thinking a bit about it, and in this crisis, there is a certain territoriality. For example, countries that rely strongly on tourism are more affected by closures or restrictions to travel than others, or those who have a less resilient health system, for example, also. So there is a bit of territoriality, but I think essentially it's a non-territorial crisis. It's something that cuts across all member states. And this might be the reason why, or one of the reasons why, international collaboration has been possible in this crisis. So the pooling of the cost. It's a bit of different perspective from the one that you present, but I don't think incompatible. Thanks.
Thank you. No, it's very, very exciting to discuss that. And I think that ultimately, and perhaps we put different terms for the same thing, is that I think the Euro crisis, in terms of the reaction to it, was most of the time looked at as a zero-sum game for national governments. Mm. So especially in the North, whatever they would give, they would need to have at least the same thing. You remember the Finnish putting as a conditionality some Greek islands as a collateral. So this is the sort of approach was very different because I think that there was nothing politically to be gained from them from a collective action. Whereas in this situation, it's a different approach, not necessarily indeed, and maybe security was a trigger, but then indeed it morphed into an economic crisis. But I think the symmetry and the fact that the external shock were of this nature, I think also gave arguments to, political leaders to just justify the collective action. Whereas before, the whole framing of why do we actually need to set up a common fund to support some economies, only some in the EU, was difficult to sell because it was divisive from the start. So perhaps that's another dimension to that lack of territoriality that you're observing this time. And indeed, now we're talking about the lack of territoriality, but there was a territorial dimension when the borders were closed, mm-hmm. when the supply chains were cut, when there was masks fragmentation in the provision, and member states working one against the other. So I think that this was also a very dark side, in a way, of European integration, which luckily was only very short. On the French-German leadership, so there, I'm not sure I completely agree with you. I think that there has been, in particular, a German change of perspective, and what at least one of the two interviewees I had on the phone was saying is that Macron had a decisive role in putting this on the agenda and ensuring that the response would be large. This would need to be corroborated by different interviews, of course. And then the German also side should be documented in the sense that, is it because Macron convinced Merkel, or is it just because Merkel convinced herself that it was a good moment to also leave a legacy, or that there was enough evidence actually that a large-scale answer was necessary? I don't know. I don't have the empirical basis to support the claim. But the two actors definitely, in terms of agenda setting, had a stronger power than I would argue than in the last situation.
Okay, thank you very much, Pierre. So I see maybe we have, yes, it's past 2 p.m., but we have time, I think, for a short question by Jean-Jacques Van Helten, and then a quick reply. Thank you.
Sorry. Very, very interesting presentation, Pierre. I just wondered if one of the things that struck me when you look at the comparison between the two crises is how by 2020 the banking sector, of course, was in a much better shape and became almost the instrument of choice, certainly from a monetary policy perspective, to support the economies across the EU. And one of the things that struck me is the speed with which the central banks responded, somewhat in one or two instances, actually ahead of the political response and the fiscal response. And I just wondered how you would sort of articulate that particular sequence of developments, because I think, for example, the ECB, Lagarde, was already talking about suspending OMT and the others before any of the EU countries themselves decided to respond from a fiscal point of view at a national level and coordinating that at EU level. So there was a different speed of response. And I think the confidence that the banking sector, at least the central banks at any rate, felt by 2020 was, of course, a remarkable change from the situation during the global financial crisis. And perhaps you could make some comment on that. Thanks.
Thank you.
Yeah. So thanks a lot, Jean-Jacques, and I agree with your reading. I think that because of the measures undertaken at the time of the euro crisis and with also the banking union, but before that also the prudential changes, the European banks were in a much better position first to address that crisis. But secondly, I think that also central banks, and not only the ECB, were also more relaxed because the origination of the shock wasn't banks. And so that meant that they felt that they had, I mean, of course, they didn't have a clue about how the pandemic would impact their models. And I think they still don't have a fixed clue about this. It's going to take time. Yeah. As you see in reflections on inflation, there are lots of debates right now about how to go about this for central banks. Is it temporary? Is it? But I think that this was also ensuring that, one, as we said earlier, it wasn't an existential euro threat in which the ECB had to hold the line. Mm-hmm. The ECB was much more prepared also because it had the SSM, so it would have a better clue about what was happening on the balance sheets of banks, whereas before this was still under the carpet of national supervisors. So there was much more information, and I think that generally the ECB felt that it could understand better how the crisis would evolve throughout the period, whereas before it was much more of a black box, at least on the impact of banks. I think that would be my short reaction to these very interesting comments.
Thank you.
Okay. Thank you very much. So it's past 2 p.m. now. The seminar comes to an end. Thank you very, very much again, Pierre. It was a very stimulating and engaging session.
Thank you.
It was really a pleasure to hear about your book and how you revisit those arguments. Thank you, everyone, also for a very high-level discussion. We reconvene in 2 weeks' time, and that will be the last seminar of this academic year. And we will have a session by Selma Benjabella and Valentin Kreilinger on COVID-19 resilience and adaptation of the EU's legislative process. And hopefully I will again see many of you for another interesting session. Thank you very much again, Pierre and everyone, and Sarah for the preparation. Have a good rest of the day, rest of the week, and happy Festa della Repubblica. And see you soon in 2 weeks again. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Daniele. Thank you,
Bye-bye.
Sarah, everyone. Bye.